Hello, everyone. Today we are going to discuss Latino culture in the US with an emphasis on Latino activism, culminating with the movement for Chicano rights known as El Movimiento. Now, for centuries, Latin America has been viewed by the United States as an exotic American backyard where banana republics existed and backwards nations survived, and where US businesses took control of entire governments. But during the last half of the 20th century, Latin Americans from many different countries entered the United States in ever increasing numbers and began to challenge these old notions and stereotypes of Latin American countries. Latinos in the United States fill jobs, go to school, serve in the military, and are increasingly involved in economics and politics. It should be no surprise that one of the largest Spanish speaking populations in the world resides inside the United States, with a population of nearly 57 million people, second only to Mexico, with a population of nearly 120 million people. And you'll notice that the figures on this infographic are a little bit dated. This was according to the 2010 Census Bureau data, and since then the population of Latinos in the United States has increased by quite a bit. The United States also shares a border with Mexico that is roughly 2,000 miles long. This border is one of the most unique locations on the planet where a highly developed nation and a struggling developing nation meet and interact. But the US Mexican border is not just a place where two different cultures meet, they overlap there. This is the location of economic, social, and cultural interactions where two cultures have coexisted for hundreds of years. Now, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the early settlement of Latinos and Hispanos in the West, and this, of course, will go back to Spanish contact. Now, by the 1840s, the offspring of Spanish conquistadors and Native Americans known as Hispanos would settle in New Mexico and Colorado's San Luis Valley. These were the earliest non-natives to do so. These Hispanos retained a uniquely Spanish and Native American culture due to their regional isolation that predates the incorporation of the Southwest into the United States. Due to their longevity in the region, Hispanos have had a substantial impact on New Mexico's culture, language, cuisine, and music since the 16th century. Hispanos were incentivized to enter what would become Colorado territory by several Spanish and Mexican land grants, creating a uniquely regional Latino culture centered around New Mexico and Colorado. And on the right side, you will see an artist's rendition of the La Garita Mission and Cemetery located in the Colorado San Luis Valley, an early settlement for Hispanos, and prior to that, an early settlement for Spanish conquistadors in the Spanish crown. In fact, some of the earliest exploration of the American West was actually conducted by Spanish explorers and conquistadors. In 1694, Spanish General Don Diego de Vargas entered Colorado's San Luis Valley, being the first European to do so. He was followed by Juan Bautista de Anza in 1779, who would later become governor of the Santa Fe Territory, controlled by the Spanish crown. It was not until 1807 that the first U.S. official, Zebulon Pike, would venture west into what would become Colorado Territory. During his expedition, Pike was arrested for trespassing by Spanish officials near the Great Sand Dunes and was taken to Santa Fe to stand trial. Pike would later go on to lead a failed attempt at scaling the Great Mountain, now known as Pikes Peak. Now, in an age of political contention and what seems like rampant racism, the US is often characterized as a white European or Anglo nation, while in reality this could not be further from the truth, with much of the US, including Colorado, formerly belonging to Spain and later Mexico. This fact has given rise to the mantra, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." For example, after 1810, much of the western United States was considered the Spanish viceroyalty of New Spain and was governed by Spanish officials usually settled conquistadors. In 1821, much of the western U.S. became part of Mexico after achieving independence from Spain. And in 1848, Mexican secession and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo establishes the present borders. So you can see that over the course of several years, the western United States has changed hands, whether it be the Spanish, Mexicans, United States, and for a brief period of time, the Texas Republic. Now, I'm not going to get too into Latino culture in the United States and family, because this is going to be covered heavily by this week's film, Mi Familia. But you should know that there are often deeply rooted traditions among Latino families in the United States. And historically, the extended family has been a strong bond of a rich source of Latin American culture. And of course, this family dynamic is on full display in this week's film, Mi Familia. Another source of Mexican immigration in the 20th century was the Barcera program. Now, during World War II, so many young American men were called into military service that the agricultural sector in the U.S. began to suffer. So in 1942, the U.S. government agreed with Mexico to allow Mexican agricultural laborers to enter the U.S. to offset the continuing and growing labor shortages. These laborers were called braceros, or laborers. The bracero numbers eventually grew to more than 400,000 laborers in the United States by the end of the 1950s, and the total number of braceros who entered the United States between 1942 and 1964 is estimated at around 4 million. But not everyone was pleased with the increasing numbers of Mexican laborers and their families who entered and resided in the United States. In 1954, the U.S. initiated Operation Wetback, which was responsible for deporting more than 1 million Mexicans out of the U.S. and back into Mexico. However, beginning in the 1930s, there were several efforts to deport people of Latino origin. This is depicted in this week's film, Mi Familia. But in 1954, Operation Wetback used military-style tactics to forcibly remove Mexican immigrants, many of them American citizens, from the United States, sending them back to central Mexico regardless if they had any connection to the country or region. Operation Wetback was a response to pressure from Anglo farmers and business interests upset about Mexican immigrants living in the United States. Upon implementation, Operation Wetback gave rise to mass arrests and deportations by the U.S. Border Patrol. Recently, Operation Wetback has been back in the headlines as Donald Trump touted it as the inspiration for his current immigration policy during a Fox interview. And on the left, you'll see a couple of pictures. First, a photo depicting Operation Wetback and the forcible removal of Mexican laborers from the U.S. in 1954. The bottom is a photo of children separated from parents at the U.S. border, taken this year as a response to the policy by the Trump administration. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Latino countercultures within the U.S. now, mainly the Pachuco counterculture and the Cholo counterculture. Now, a growing population of Latinos in the U.S. gave birth to several Chicano countercultures, including the Pachucos and the Cholos. Pachucos were a 1940s counterculture associated with zoot suit fashion, jazz, and swing music, and rejecting assimilation into Anglo-American society. The Pachuco counterculture flourished among Chicano men, and it was used as a symbol of rebellion, especially in Los Angeles. Some Pachucos adopted strong attitudes of social defiance, engaging in la vida loca, seen as a deviant way of life by white society. This included marijuana smoking, some gang activity, and a turbulent nightlife. Pachuco Zoot Suiters were influenced by black Zoot Suiters in the jazz and swing music scene on the East Coast. And in LA, Chicano Zoot Suiters developed their own cultural identity with their hair done in big pompadours and draped in tailor made suits. They also spoke a dialect called Calo, their own language, which was kind of a cool jive of half English and half Spanish. The Pachuco counterculture would become iconic among Latinos and is a predecessor for the Cholo subculture, which emerged among Chicano youth in the 1980s. Now, the Cholo subculture, still in full effect today, especially in East LA, included lowrider cars and a distinctive artistic and cultural style. Some aspects of this lifestyle are captured in the Netflix documentary LA Originals, if anybody is interested in learning more about the Cholo subculture. Now, the Anglo perspective of the Pachuco and the Cholo and their connection to marijuana and gang activity became major instigators for Mexican stereotypes. And in 1943, tensions between Pachucos and the police reached a boiling point with the Zoot Suit riots in LA. And here's a short clip with some really great historical photos depicting the Zoot Suit riots in LA.
The Zoot Suit riots. In June of 1943, the city of Los Angeles experienced one of the most significant episodes of racial violence in the 20th century, known as the Zoot Suit riots. Racial tensions had been rising in the city and were made only worse by the biased reporting of the Los Angeles media. When a group of American sailors attacked a group of mostly Mexican Americans in East LA, the city exploded. In hindsight, this seemed inevitable. With many young men overseas as a result of World War II, labor in the United States was in short supply. So in 1942, the US government reached a deal with Mexico named the Bracero Program, which allowed some Mexican citizens to move to the US as temporary workers. Los Angeles already had a large Mexican American population, but this new influx of workers provoked greater racial animosity. Much of the white population, whose views were echoed in the mass media, blamed Mexican American teenagers and young adults for various issues in the city, especially crime. Even the way Mexican Americans dressed angered the city's more conservative population. Many young Mexican Americans started donning the zoot suit, a style that incorporated an oversized coat, pork pie hat, long chain, thick-soled shoes, and baggy pants. This fashion evolved out of Harlem nightclubs and was popularized by cultural icons like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. The suits themselves weren't inherently offensive, but in the context of World War II, they were. You see, during the war, wool had been rationed in order to make uniforms for the troops. The very manufacturing of zoot suits with their excessive use of fabric was banned, but a black market developed, and so those zoot suit-wearing Mexican Americans, known as Pachucos, were seen as unpatriotic. On the night of August 1st, 1942, Pachucos were involved in a brawl in a home near Los Angeles' Sleepy Lagoon. The next morning, the body of Jose Diaz was discovered nearby. The media and police quickly blamed the zoot suit-wearing 38th Street gang. Hundreds of Pachucos were rounded up, regardless of affiliation. 22 were eventually found guilty for the Sleepy Lagoon murder in what was later considered a great miscarriage of justice. To some, the verdict was grossly unfair. To others, it confirmed what they already believed, that the zoot suit wearers were inherently violent. This all helped to create a powder keg bound to explode. A few months later, a group of 16 American sailors stationed in Los Angeles claimed they were verbally taunted by a group of Pachuco zoot suiters. Seeking retaliation, the servicemen took cabs over to the Mexican neighborhoods in East LA and started attacking those wearing zoot suits with makeshift weapons. The Pachucos were thrown into the street. their zoot suits torn off and burned on the spot. The ensuing riot continued to snowball over the following days. Violence spread to include both Pachucos and young African American men. But instead of arresting the attackers, police arrested the victims, supposedly for their own protection. By June 8th, the rioting had become so severe that all military personnel were banned from Los Angeles, and military police were brought in to subdue the attackers. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the impact of the Zoot Suit riots would reach far beyond the number of casualties. Once the dust had settled, Governor Earl Warren commissioned a report that was meant to paint Californians in a more positive light. Instead, the Independent Citizens Commission found the chief cause of the riots was racism, naming the city's newspapers for encouraging the riots and the city government and U.S. military for allowing those riots to continue. Historians view the Zoot Suit riots as a culmination of anti-Mexican racism that had been building for years in Los Angeles, exacerbated by the stresses of World War II. The riots forced the country to face these problems head on and confront the systemic oppression faced by Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and throughout the country.
Following the Zoot Suit riots, the tumultuous 1940s that of course included the end of World War II, the educational opportunities of the GI Bill allowed for young Latino men to experience new ideas and leave the security of their communities to seek a better life for their family, for the first time in generations. After serving equally in an international war, many Latinos in the US demanded equal treatment at home for the first time. This ushered in a new era of civil rights. As time went on, migrant laborers were continued to be paid low wages and given no benefits. Their children were not placed in public schools, and many families continued to live in dilapidated homes. For many Latinos who served, they came home to clear-cut racial discrimination that was still ingrained in the American way of life. And to them, this was unacceptable. As a result, many Latinos in the US became involved in the Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, which has deep roots within Colorado. Now, in order to examine the Chicano movement in Colorado, it is important to first take a step back and look at the political climate of the 1960s and some of the legislation that it inspired. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty legislation really marks the beginning of the Chicano movement in Colorado because for the first time it made social mobility viable for a majority of Colorado Hispanics. Also, as I go on talking throughout this lecture, you'll notice that I may use various terms interchangeably. I'll use the term Hispanic, Latino, Mexicano, all of which are referring to Mexican Americans living within Colorado. And I always like to quote my friend Vincent de Baca when he says, "At various times I've called myself a Hispano, a Mexicano, a Mexican American, Chicano, an American, and I dare say sometimes I even think I'm a human being." So just know going forward that a lot of those terms will be used interchangeably. Now, kind of the cornerstone of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act. This was the centerpiece of the legislation. This motivated government agencies, nonprofits, university departments, church programs, and individuals to enact programs that reduced the effects of poverty. Rural Colorado Hispanics had previously been reserved to a life of migrant labor, directly benefited from these types of programs. Also, the Migrant Action Program, also known as MAP, in 1967, this was influenced by the overall philosophy of the War on Poverty. This Migrant Action Program was created at CU. It was run by the university and federally funded through the Educational Opportunity Program that we just discussed above. Now, prior to MAP, the Migrant Action Program, the few Latinos who attended the university came almost entirely from landowning families in southern Colorado or northern New Mexico. Most of these rather rich families identified more with Anglo students on campus, not even so much so with the smaller number of African or Asian students on campus. Um, Now, they believe that these many talented Latino children in Colorado who came from poor families had gone to mediocre schools, especially the children of farm workers. They believed they could succeed in higher education if unnecessary rigid admissions requirements were modified and if they received sufficient financial aid and good advising. Now, MAPS organizers went out to recruit students actively. They worked recruiting students initially with agricultural families in the San Luis Valley. And MAP representatives told prospective students that they could be accepted into the university without the usual requirements that would be given for financial aid. Once on campus, they were supposed to receive extra academic and personal support because most of these Migrant Action Program recipients were very much untraditional students, often the first in their families to ever attend a university. Um, Now, these new Chicano students on their college campuses were active not only on campus but also in town as they tried to raise awareness about the wider causes of the day. And of course, one of the main wider causes of the day was, of course, the civil rights movement. In 1968, UMass, the United Mexican American Student Union, began at the University of Colorado. Now, this began with about 6 students. UMass was originally organized by MAP students, Migrant Action Program students, and the organization's role was to create a community that would promote academic success. Also, UMass happened to be the most politically active student organization on campus, and many Migrant Action Program and UMass students hung out together. They hung together for support in often an unwelcoming academic, economic, and cultural world that was unlike what they had previously known. Now, one inspiring example, a rather moving story of a Migrant Action Program student's acceptance and arrival at the University of Colorado is told by Cleopatra Jaramillo through the Boulder County Oral History Project. Cleo grew up in Center, Colorado, a very small community in the San Luis Valley in Colorado that is dominated by large commercial farms owned by white landowners. Her father was employed at the local lumber yard, and her mother worked the fields, both good jobs by local standards. Cleo and all of her 7 siblings, when they were not in school, thinned and weeded lettuce in the spring and summer, and they hoed and dug potatoes in the fall. Cleo always did very well through school, and she did very well in high school. And she had hoped one day that she might be able to save up enough money to go to Adams State College in the San Luis Valley. Though there was no teacher or counselor at her school who ever suggested that she could go to college at all. In August of 1969, just a few months after her high school graduation, Cleo was approached while working in the fields by her Aunt Jenny. Her Aunt Jenny was a known community organizer for the Economic Opportunity Program in Center and also was volunteering with the United Farm Workers at the time. Now, Jenny had heard that the University of Colorado had started a program of special scholarships for the children of farm workers and had nominated Cleo without her knowledge. She had just been notified that Cleo was accepted. "You're going to college," she announced, to Cleo's total surprise. A few weeks later, Jenny took Cleo to Boulder, where she registered and became a member of the Migrant Action Program and of the United Mexican American Student Union, UMass. Cleo was amazed at how undemanding her life as a student was compared to her life working in fields. And you can kind of see this in this quote here where she says, "I started taking classes and I thought, man, this is so easy. If people even knew how hard it is to go from row to row in the fields all day long, but here you get to read a book. Who knew that Boulder existed and that people were treated like kings and queens here?" So that's kind of just exemplifying a stark difference between the previous life of many of these Migrant Action Program recipients and the world that they gained access to through the University of Colorado. Now, thanks to the inclusive environment created at CU in conjunction with UMass, migrant students enjoyed a 95% success rate, with most students graduating in 4 years. You can compare that to a 6 years on average it takes an undergraduate to earn a bachelor's degree today at UCCS even. So this is remarkably impressive. Now, at the same time, well, Migrant Action Program students were being accepted to the Boulder campus, a larger Chicano movement was also mobilizing in Denver. In 1969, a social studies teacher at West High School in Denver made some disparaging anti-Mexican remarks openly in class. This incident led to the West High School walkout on March 20th and 21st. In this and other walkouts, Denver students demanded curriculum reforms, including instruction about the history, culture, and contribution of Chicanos. They also demanded amnesty for students who walked out. These walkouts really gave birth to the Chicano studies programs being created at universities. Prior to these demands, ethnic and Chicano studies programs were not offered at all at most mainstream universities. Also at this same time, a gentleman in Colorado named Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, a former boxer, poet, and political activist, he led the expansion of the Crusade for Justice. The Crusade for Justice were generating not only strong support in Denver, but also strong opposition, especially from law enforcement at the time. Now, the Crusade for Justice from the 1960s to the 1980s was a full-blown, comprehensive civil rights organization, or as Corky Gonzalez called it, a human rights organization. It provided a full array of community services, including employment, legal defense, education, civil rights, political action, immigration, and recreation. Chicanos and others who had problems, especially with the police or schools or on the job, came to the Crusade for Justice headquarters for help, comfort, and relief. The Crusade building at 16th Avenue and Downing Street in Denver, near the current Auraria campus, had a bookstore, a churro shop, a large lunchroom, a boxing gym, an auditorium, 24 classrooms, lounge, art studios, print shops. It was known to house one of the finest Mexican ballet groups outside of Mexico, and it also housed a school program that taught students from preschool all the way to undergraduate college programs. The Crusade for Justice also hosted 3 national Chicano youth conferences in Denver in 1969, 1970, and 1971. And from the first conference came what was called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. And this really set the goals for the broader national Chicano movement. So this really highlights what an important place Denver was at the peak of this Chicano movement. It was kind of a focal point, a gathering point for many of these activist youths. Now, at the same time this was going on, Cesar Chavez was also organizing farm workers' strikes in the San Luis Valley, and the United Farm Workers had instituted a national boycott on items that included grapes grown in California, Safeway stores, and of course Coors beer that had a major impact here in Colorado. And the reason that Coors beer was involved is because Pete Coors at the time, the CEO of Coors, was outspokenly anti-Mexican. He made various disparaging remarks regarding the movement and actually verbally attacked many of the movement's leaders. And not only that, Coors put a lot of money into the the movements that were against the United Farm Workers. So this caused an impetus for many Latinos, not just in Colorado, but nationally, to boycott Coors beer. So this is just kind of paints the picture of what was going on, not just in greater Colorado, but also nationally. We had Corky Gonzalez here in Colorado. We had Cesar Chavez really nationally, but kind of focused in California. And here you can see a photo of Cesar Chavez talking with Corky Gonzalez. And then at the bottom here, you'll see a couple of photos depicting some strikes for the United Farm Workers. The one on the left is actually a Coors boycott. Now, at this same time, this movement begins to erupt in Boulder amongst United Mexican American Student Union, the UMass students, many of whom families were involved in this greater United Farm Workers strike in rural Colorado. So, kind of just a timeline of how this movement progressed within Boulder and at CU. In 1968, there were only about 50 Mexican American students enrolled at the University of Colorado. By the summer of 1969, UMass summer programs had begun, and thanks to UMass and the Migrant Action Program, Chicano enrollment grew to over 1,400. Now, by 1970, President Nixon was elected to the presidency, and he actually began dismantling Lyndon Johnson's Economic Opportunity Act. So in 1971, CU also began to dismantle the United Mexican American Student Union, and this sparked widespread campus unrest. Students and faculty at CU, many of whom wanted UMass removed because they actually labeled UMass and the Migrant Action Program as racist because the funding was not also going to white students. So by 1972, there's a lot of upheaval taking place in the University of Colorado campus regarding the elimination of UMass and the Migrant Action Program. And CU orders Pat Vigil, director of UMass, to fire the Chicano activist Ricardo Falcon, who was a really charismatic and popular student leader at the time. Now, Vigil flat out refuses to fire Falcon, who he believed was critical in the expansion of UMass and the overall success of the Migrant Action Program at the University of Colorado. So CU decided to fire both Vigil and Falcon in response. In response to these firings, the students rallied in support of Falcon and Vigil. And these rallies are led by student activists Priscilla Falcon, the wife of Ricardo Falcon, Florencio Granado, and Roberto Turan. Now, those are important names that are going to come up later, so it's important that you guys kind of keep those names in the forefront of your mind. But because of these three students' involvement in the defense of Vigil and Falcon, CU responded by also expelling these three students. So you had two CU employees who were fired, and then also the three students who came out in support of them also being removed from the school. So by fall of 1973, the financial aid to the Economic Opportunity Program was significantly delayed, and the UMass students decided to take over Regent Hall, demanding their financial aid. This actually worked and causes CU to cave, reinstating the financial aid to these students. Aid back. In fall of 1974, CU once again began taking systematic steps to dismantle UMass, the United Mexican American Student Union, and MAP, the Migrant Action Program, at CU. Among the first of these steps was to appoint Joe Franco as director of the program. While Franco was Hispanic, students believed that he did not truly have the interests of the community at heart and served essentially as a yes man to the university. In the eyes of activists, Franco needed to be removed. To this end, they occupied temporary building number 1, TB number 1, the former UMass headquarters, where they remained for 18 days. During this time, the occupancy grew from 8 students to over 80 UMass students, and the Boulder Police Department had to seek the help of FBI snipers to gain control of the situation. On May 30th, 1974, the occupation ends after CU agrees to negotiations with UMass students. But this only takes place after violence ensues. On May 27th, 1974, while temporary building number 1 was still being occupied by UMass students, an explosion can be heard throughout Boulder. The smoldering remains of a car are found at Chautauqua Park, not far from the CU campus. 3 Chicano student organizers who were directly involved in the temporary building number 1 occupation are killed instantly. These students are Neva Romero, a 21-year-old CU junior, Una Jacola, a 24-year-old CU double major, and Reyes Martinez, a 26-year-old CU law school graduate and Alamosa civil rights attorney. Just 2 days later, another explosion occurs at a local liquor store, killing 3 more Chicano activists involved in student protests at temporary building number 1. These students are Francisco Daughtry, 20-year-old Texas pre-med student, Herberto Terran, a 31-year-old former CU student, and Florencio Granado, a 31-year-old who had attended CU. And this is a image that was left at the scene of the second bombing. It's also one of the very few pictures of the scenes of the bombings that exist. But this was left at the scene, inscribed with, "Upon these ruins, we will build a movement 10,000 times stronger." Now, the view from the media and the government surrounding these 2 bombings in Boulder was that Neva Romero was probably holding the bomb when it detonated. This is despite ample evidence that they were just going on a quick beer run and were actually parked in the parking lot of a local liquor store at the time. The media actually characterized these activists as violent radicals who died making their own bombs, and they claimed that many radicals were bombing places all over the nation at the time, which was somewhat true, so why would this be any different? Now, the bombing shook the Chicano community and really had the impact of halting the Chicano movement in Colorado when coupled with the Crusade for Justice bombing that we discussed earlier. Many Chicano activists believe that Los Seis de Boulder were the victims of the FBI's COINTELPRO program, who were involved in the assassination of Black Panthers and American Indian movement leaders. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a series of covert and at times illegal projects conducted by the United States FBI aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting American political organizations. FBI records show that COINTELPRO resources targeted groups and individuals that the FBI deemed, quote, subversive. So it's really no stretch of the imagination that these Chicano activists would have been investigated by this program, because based on existing documents that have been declassified, Corky Gonzalez in Denver, as well as Cesar Chavez and many of the key Chicano movement leaders within Colorado were directly being investigated under the COINTELPRO program. Now, the investigation surrounding these 2 bombings was incredibly sloppy and, by a lot of accounts, very biased. There was actually a lot of flesh left at the scene of the crime. And the FBI would let random people onto the crime scene People today still have parts of the car that were never entered into evidence. This uh, questionability surrounding these two bombings sparked a grand jury investigation, which actually declared the investigation itself, quote, racist, although there was not enough evidence to convict anyone. Now, there exists a pattern affecting the same groups of people raising questions surrounding the involvement of COINTELPRO. Tehran and Granado were both expelled from CU for student activism, and after the first bombing, Granado declared war on the United States, saying, quote, "These people were murdered by the US government. It is our job to avenge them." The very next day, he is killed. Neva Romero was the first Latina elected to CU student government, and Reyes Martinez's brother was on the run from the FBI in Mexico, and his family was very well known to law enforcement agencies. There were also 3 bombs that were set off prior to the 2 that killed these students, although in these 3 bombs no one was injured. After the second bombing, there was also talk of, quote, a package being thrown into a car that is heard over police scanners. And unfortunately, none of this can be investigated the same way that, say, the Black Panthers were in their association with COINTELPRO through the release of documents, because all the FBI investigation records surrounding these 2 bombings in Boulder were burned in an FBI file holding center in Kansas in 1981. This is a mysterious fire that was never really investigated, and it was just deemed an accident. So there's not any real recourse to investigate these bombings via declassified government documents. Um, that likely would have been very helpful, because we have found out that the FBI was targeting and assassinating people involved with the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers, and we were able to clear that up through declassified documents. But unfortunately, in this case, they have been burned. Now, the Los Seis de Boulder, the 6 students who were killed in the 2 car bombings, were just 6 of 9 activists killed during the Chicano movement within Colorado. And they are considered very much martyrs amongst civil rights activists in Colorado and throughout the larger Chicano movement. And this is just a commemorative issue of a newspaper titled La Cucaracha, which was actually a Chicano movement newspaper during the Chicano movement. But they released this commemorative issue in 2014 celebrating the 9 martyrs that were killed in connection to the Colorado Chicano movement. Now today, the Los Seis de Boulder, the 6 activists killed in Boulder, are still celebrated every year in May, along with the individuals who were active in occupying temporary building number 1. At the bottom there, you see a photo of some of the students who initially occupied that building. They come back every year to celebrate the lives of the 6 students who were lost in these bombings, and also the legacy of the Chicano movement. And I'm going to go ahead and end today with a short corrido celebrating Los Seis de Boulder. And for those of you who don't know, a corrido is a Mexican story song that really commemorates an event or an issue. So I'm going to go ahead and play that, and we will end this lecture.
Voy a cantar un corrido que en Colorado pasó. Murieron los 6 de Boulder 2 noches en mayo 74. Era una noche ocupada cuando de pronto llegó. Ese bombazo hieloso, como a las 8, 3 vidas llevó. Amaneció en la mañana, ahí en la sierra yo vi la alma del Romero subiendo hacia el cielo, subiendo hasta el fin. En este cielo de sierra, de colorado se ven las almas de 6 soldados, 6 fusilados, 6 hijos del bien.